Help fight demonetization by visiting thearmchairhistorian.com. This video is brought to you by Ironside. You might have seen my Ironside laptop on display in some of my videos, but you'll probably be surprised to find out that I also have an Ironside PC. Ironside was kind enough to send me a Nemesis Ultra. You can find the specifications on screen. This piece of top-of-the-line hardware has superior build quality and wields the power of NVIDIA GeForce graphics and an Intel Core processor. Expect lightning-fast speeds and peak performance through even the toughest of tasks, powering through any game with unprecedented performance and power efficiency thanks to the all-new NVIDIA Pascal architecture. With Intel Core processing and high-end NVIDIA graphics, you'll forget what the words frame drop and medium settings ever meant. Every Ironside computer is expertly crafted to maximize every bit of power in your system. Rigorously tested for up to 72 hours, they ensure that your PC is functioning at its absolute maximum for its years of usage. Every PC receives the best quality packaging, including double boxing and Instafoam to hold all of your PC's components securely in place. With all of that said, if you'd like to look into getting an Ironside laptop or computer yourself, check out their website at ironsidecomputers.com. We'd recommend you get the limited time Gamma PC, which is what another member of our team uses. We're excited to announce that this video marks the start of our new mini-series on the North African campaign. This often disregarded theater of war was of huge importance, encompassing the struggle for vital oil fields, critical trade routes, and the port cities that the Allies would eventually use to liberate Italy. First, a little background. When Benito Mussolini rose to power in 1922, he began to pursue one of his primary, albeit not so realistic, goals: the resurrection of the Roman Empire. Mussolini recognized that this would be a long and arduous process, as both Italy's industrial capacity and military were in no position to compete with the European superpowers of Great Britain and France. The British, in particular, represented a significant obstacle in that they controlled both the Suez Canal and Gibraltar, the only waterways connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. This provided Britain with the single most efficient means of transporting goods from South Asia to Europe. If the British lost the Suez Canal, naturally they would suffer a huge blow to trade and colonial management. When Hitler repudiated the Treaty of Versailles, the Italians felt confident enough to invade Ethiopia in 1935, which put them even closer to the strategic waterway in Egypt. The Italians could not openly declare war on Britain just yet, but in 1940 they saw their moment, after German troops entered France. Mussolini promptly redirected forces in West Libya to mass on the Egyptian border. Before we get into the details of the ensuing military campaign, we should spend a minute talking about the tactical aspects that made this campaign so fascinating. Before it commenced, the Desert War in Northern Africa was sometimes referred to as a tactician's dream. There were a lot of lofty ideas about how the flat and mostly featureless terrain would provide a sort of real-world chessboard where military theory about mechanized warfare could be put to the test. Some military planners even believed that the open country would allow tanks to glide around like warships on the open ocean. That is the plot of a fantasy novel, not the reality of combat in World War II. Food, water, and gasoline had to be hauled over large distances in enormous quantities to even begin to meet the combatants' needs. Historian Paddy Griffith sums it up well, writing, "North Africa was such an unforgiving environment, in these and many other ways, that every mile traveled required a mechanical effort equivalent to well over 2 miles traveled in Northwest Europe, and of course in North Africa, there were many more miles to be traveled." Now let's get back to the front line. Expecting a quick German victory against the Allies, Benito Mussolini wanted, quote, "a few thousand dead," to gain a seat at the negotiating table. Therefore, his instructions to Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, Governor-General of the colony in Libya and commander of the Italian 10th Army, were as brief as they were unhelpful: attack the British in front of you. Graziani, who had earned the nickname of the Butcher of the Desert, hesitated to go through with Mussolini's very elaborate plans. In early September of 1940, he was short on equipment, and British hit-and-run tactics cost him nearly 3,500 men, while the Royal Navy harassed his supply ports at Benghazi and Tobruk. By mid-September, Graziani was forced by Mussolini to make his move, and actually managed to penetrate 100 kilometers into British territory. Portions of the Italian 10th Army, totaling 80,000 of his 250,000 men, got as far as the city of Sidi Barrani in northwest Egypt, which they captured on September 16th. Unfortunately for the bumbling butcher, that was when all of those logistical issues that I mentioned earlier really caught up with him. Graziani ended up spending more than 2 months waiting for resupply, a period that the Allies mockingly referred to as his Sitzkrieg. And while Graziani was trying to get organized, his enemies were successfully doing just that. Sir Archibald Wavell, who commanded the British Army in the Middle East, had thus far been bluffing quite successfully. Italian forces in the north consisted of around 250,000 men, and in the south, 350,000. Wavell had just 86,000 under his command. It was only through a number of elaborate ruses, including inflatable dummy tanks and false tracks, that he was able to hold the Italians at bay. With more material and manpower freed up by the victory at the Battle of Britain, Wavell decided it was time to stop using balloon tanks and start using real tanks. Under the command of Major General Richard O'Connor, plans were made for an offensive codenamed Operation Compass. Just before dusk, on December 7th, the British 7th Armoured and the 4th Indian Divisions set out for the Italian front line. For days, the advance continued undetected by Italian forces. On the 9th, the British Western Force ambushed the Italian garrison at Naibewa, taking approximately 2,000 prisoners. Despite Graziani's overwhelming numerical advantage, O'Connor consistently brought more tanks to any given engagement by massing his forces together against Graziani's spread-out defensive perimeter. Within days, Graziani's front line was broken, and he quickly ordered a retreat back to Bardia in Libya. Just 3 days after the start of Operation Compass, Italian forces were completely withdrawn from Egypt, and O'Connor pushed on. Despite their victory, the British military suffered significant setbacks during the pursuit. The 7th Armoured Division suffered a critical loss of vehicles, and the 4th Indian Division was sent to garrison Sudan, being replaced by the more inexperienced 6th Australian Division. Nonetheless, O'Connor was able to capitalize on captured Italian vehicles and fuel to move forward. When he arrived at Bardia on December 27th, he found it well prepared, protected by mines, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and anti-tank ditches constructed along a 30-kilometer defensive line. With his fresh Australian troops taking point, he launched his assault. The attack was heavily supplemented by air attacks by the RAF and bombardment by the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet. On January 5th, the town was occupied by the British, and 2/3 of the Italian 10th Army had been killed or captured. Promptly after this victory, the 7th Armoured Division cut off Tobruk, and the Australians came to lay siege. By late January, the Italian garrison of 25,000 surrendered. The remainder of Graziani's 10th Army retreated as fast as it could, with the British in hot pursuit running almost entirely off of captured gasoline. When the Italians were close to escaping the grasp of the 7th Armoured Division, a detachment of mechanized vehicles was sent out to race ahead of the Italian 10th Army at Beta Fam. Italian forces heading from Benghazi were ambushed and stalled by this detachment, which bought enough time for the rest of the British tanks to arrive. In Stephen W. Sears' book, Desert War in North Africa, he writes this: "In 2 months, O'Connor had advanced 500 miles, with a force never larger than 30,000 men. He had taken 130,000 prisoners, 380 tanks, and almost 850 pieces of field artillery. His total casualties came to just over 1,900. After the defeat of the Italian army, the British government, confident that there would be no counterattack anytime soon, relocated most of the British troops stationed in North Africa in an attempt to hold off an Axis invasion in Greece. But all this time, across the sea, Adolf Hitler had been keeping a wary eye on the repeated defeats of his allies. With about as much faith in Mussolini's strategic mind as was probably warranted, he dispatched one of his most gifted generals, a man who had distinguished himself as a tank commander during the invasion of France. That man was Erwin Rommel, and he brought with him a reckoning. Operation Compass, the codename for the first Allied military operation of the Western Desert Campaign, had been an enormous success for the British, thanks to General Sir Archibald Wavell and his subordinate Richard O'Connor. However, the Allies' winning streak was about to come to an end. On February 9th, Winston Churchill ordered the 6th Australian Division to cross the Mediterranean and join the Allied defense of Greece at nearly the same moment that Germany's newly created Afrika Corps began deploying in Libya. Since the British did not expect a counterattack in Libya, most of the 7th Armored Division returned to Egypt to defend Her Majesty's holdings there. As a result, when Erwin Rommel arrived with 65,000 German troops, in addition to the 55,000 Italians already present, he was able to bring a 120,000-man hammer down on the dangerously strung-out Allies. In the entirety of the Middle East theater, Wavell had around 118,000 men under his command as part of the newly reformed 8th Army. They were supported by a large quantity of aircraft and the superior British Navy. However, the British forces' overextension meant that they were unprepared for the concentrated Axis assault. Despite Rommel's orders to take a defensive stance until more reinforcements arrived in May of 1941, the ambitious commander took action after remarkably easy early offensive victories at Al Aguila and Mersa Brega. Before long, he put the German plans for Operation Sonnenblume, or Sunflower, into action early. Our historian friend from the last episode, Stephen W. Sears, notes that the army that faced Rommel was not the fast-moving, quick-thinking force that had chased Marshal Graziani out of Egypt. The desert rats of the 7th Armored Division had been replaced by the newly arrived 2nd Armored Division, and the 6th Australian Division was relieved by another Australian division, untrained and poorly equipped. Like O'Connor did before him, Rommel split his forces in an attempt to cut the enemy off, ordering some troops to take the coastal route and ordering others to go through Cyrenaica. As for O'Connor himself, in an almost inconceivable blunder, the British officer's unescorted staff car took a wrong turn and drove right into Axis forces. He and his intended replacement, Philip Neame, along with John Coombe, the man who ambushed the retreating Italian army in 1940, were captured, and Wavell was down 3 of his most experienced senior officers. By mid-April, Benghazi had fallen, and nearly all of the British forces in Libya had been successfully pushed back to Egypt, with one notable exception: those at Tobruk. This fortified position was held by the remnants of the Australian 9th and 7th Divisions, along with several divisions of English and Commonwealth artillery who had fled there during Rommel's initial advance. One of the recurring themes in this series is the difficulty of keeping troops supplied in a huge desert battlefield like North Africa. To quote Stephen Sears once more, as Marshal Graziani had ruefully noted, desert war imposed its own special rules. Rule number 1 was that armies brought with them everything they needed. There was no such thing as living off the country. Rommel would need Tobruk as a resupply port to have any chance of pushing into Egypt. Thus began a seemingly endless siege of the isolated Allied position. Surrounded on 3 sides, the 23,000-man garrison was assisted and supplied by the Royal Navy, but lacked air support, becoming the frequent target of Luftwaffe raids. The Germans and Italians sent wave after wave of troops against the Australians, but the defenses of Tobruk had been bolstered into a fortress. Royal Engineers created a 30-mile semicircle of trenches and hardened defensive structures. Peppered in were lengths of barbed wire, tank traps, and landmines. Without the reinforcements, it seemed that Rommel would not be able to root out the troublesome Aussies on his flank and would have to be content with containing them. Spring saw numerous advances on either side that were quickly repelled. First among them was the aptly named Operation Brevity, which only lasted from May 15th to the 16th. British forces made slight gains that were nearly immediately undone by Axis counterattacks. Those incursions culminated with Axis forces seizing the choke point at Halfaya Pass on May 26th and the 27th, but were unable to move any further. As summer was nearing, Wavell received reinforcements as part of another operation, codenamed Tiger, a daring mission that saw 238 tanks ferried across the Mediterranean in relatively slow, vulnerable merchant ships protected by a Royal Navy escort. To be fair to Wavell, as Supreme Commander of all British forces in the Middle East, his troops had to contend not just with Rommel's Afrika Corps, but also with the remaining Italians in East Africa, local rebellions in their oil-rich colonial holdings in Iraq, and the threat of Axis troops landing in Vichy French Syria and Lebanon. What's more, he was also responsible for overseeing the key Allied defensive positions in the Mediterranean, such as Crete and Malta. If the desert campaign really was the game of chess contemporary military strategists thought it was, Wavell was playing 3 games at once against 3 different opponents. On June 15th, Wavell launched Operation Battleaxe, a British and Indian offensive intended to push the German forces out of Halfaya Pass, with the ultimate goal of relieving Tobruk. And it proved no more successful than past attempts, and was called off after just 2 days. The frustrated Churchill relieved Wavell 3 weeks later and replaced him with the Commander-in-Chief of India, Claude the Auk Auchinleck, on July 5th. Sears notes, "From the failure of Battleaxe, the British concluded that their tanks were outgunned by those of the enemy, when in most cases the actual killers were the anti-tank guns, particularly the 88 flak. The failure to appreciate the full value of the anti-tank gun was to haunt the British in months to come." The Auk spent the next few months resupplying and regrouping, while Rommel tried in vain to overwhelm the Australian garrison in Tobruk. The Aussies had no problem standing their ground, presumably because everything back home in Australia tries to kill you anyways. The Royal Navy continued to resupply them under the cover of darkness, and in September they were successfully rotated out of the city. Taking their place was the British 70th Division, the Polish Carpathian Brigade, and the Czechoslovak 11th Infantry Battalion. This mixed Allied force would hold the city for the rest of the siege. In November, British reinforcements joined with those from India, Sudan, South Africa, and New Zealand, swelling the Auk's forces and prompting him to initiate Operation Crusader. By this point, the Auk had about 700 tanks, comprising Crusaders, Matildas, and the American Lend-Leased tank, the Stuart. Rommel had just 390 tanks, mainly comprising Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. Despite what Battlefield 5 might tell you, there were no Tigers present in 1941. The operation, which the Auk had placed under the command of Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham, commenced on November 18th with a push into Salem and Bardia. While the British, South Africans, and Indians besieged the Axis forces there, the New Zealanders moved north to relieve Tobruk. On the 21st, a detachment of British and South African troops were dispatched to attack Sidi Rezegh, but were cut off and nearly destroyed when Rommel cut between those units in the north and the ones still fighting at Salem and Bardia. The New Zealanders did manage to reach Sidi Rezegh by November 25th and make contact with the garrison at Tobruk on the 30th. However, the units that were supposed to support them were so badly beaten that Cunningham urged the Auk to let them retreat. In response, Cunningham was fired and replaced with General Neil Ritchie. Truth be told, the British went through commanders so quickly that my artist couldn't keep up with drawing them, so here's a stick figure one of my writers drew. The New Zealanders, now experiencing heavy fighting on all sides, were ultimately unable to liberate Tobruk and withdrew back to Egypt on December 1st. However, as Rommel was never able to take Tobruk, he could only be resupplied from Tripoli, and even then only 1/3 of his intended materials survived the Royal Navy's interdictions. Once more, British forces had been consistently reinforced throughout the year, while the German campaign in Russia and the Balkans diverted any available Axis manpower away from North Africa. After a failed attempt to relieve the dangerously isolated Italian garrisons at Sollum and Bardia, the Axis forces were forced to retreat as they were out of supplies, allowing the garrison at Tobruk to finally be liberated on the 10th after more than 8 months of grueling siege. By the end of 1941, the Allies had rapidly pushed Axis forces west along the North African coast, hoping to finally capture the elusive Erwin Rommel at Beta Fam. Instead, he once again escaped and dug in at El Agela, where the Brits presumed he would assume a defensive posture. General Claude Auchinleck believed that Rommel's forces were too depleted by the events of the previous year to launch a meaningful counterattack. He and his staff had badly miscalculated. On January 21st, 1942, the Germans launched a punishing counterattack that pushed the British 8th Army out of almost all of the territory that they had recaptured as part of Operation Crusader. During the first weeks of February, Axis forces swept east through Cyrenaica, while the British retreated again and again. On February 6th, the front lines finally stabilized some 60 kilometers west of Tobruk, as Rommel was once again hamstrung by his need for reinforcements. The 8th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, who my artist just still hasn't had enough time to draw, formed a defensive line from the Gazala Inlet in the north to Bur Hakim. The AUK, under strong pressure from Prime Minister Winston Churchill, ordered Ritchie to attack. However, our favorite stick figure was worried that the Axis forces would again sweep south of any new incursion. As a compromise, the plan for the upcoming Operation Buckshot called for reserve units to be positioned to the center and south behind a leading force. Before it could even begin, however, Ritchie was proven right. On the evening of May 26th, the Afrika Korps' 21st Panzer, 15th Panzer, and 90th Light Infantry Divisions swung south, while 4 Italian divisions remained to oppose the Gazala line. The attacking force annihilated Ritchie's reserve units, but in a turn of events that should surprise absolutely nobody who's been watching this series, insufficient fuel and ammunition once again stifled Rommel's attack. Unable to finish their march to the sea, the now isolated Axis divisions took a defensive position at a location they called the Cauldron on May 29th. During the first week of June, the Allies launched air and ground assaults against the Cauldron. For a moment, it seemed like Rommel might be encircled, but on June 1st, his panzers managed to break through to their west and reunite with the remaining Italians. Watching the Gazala line crumble, Ritchie ordered the 13th and 30th Corps to retreat to Egypt, leaving only the 19,000-man 2nd South African Division at Tobruk. Once again, the Allies fled east, and once again, the port city was in the crosshairs of the Desert Fox. In order to capture that vital port, which had so long eluded him, Rommel knew he would need a formidable supply of both fuel and ammunition. His hungry gaze fell upon the Allied airfield at Camp Bud, where the RAF had been dropping supplies for British ground forces. That proverbial henhouse stored all of the eggs he could ever want. Bolstered by what he had taken at the RAF supply drop, Rommel attacked the city once again on the evening of the 20th. This time, rather than 9 months, the siege lasted barely a day. It was the worst British military defeat since the fall of Singapore, and was seen as especially humiliating due to the speed with which it was obtained. In recognition of his foresight before the Battle of Gazala, we at the Armchair Historian team have finally commissioned a portrait of Neil Ritchie. And in recognition of his defeat, the AUK fired him. Maybe we shouldn't have invested in his portrait after all. The AUK took direct control of the 8th Army on the 25th, but couldn't stop the Afrika Korps from sweeping aside the defenders at Mersa Matra. With the resupply depot at Tobruk finally in hand, it seemed that Axis forces were on the cusp of victory, and for his victory at Tobruk, Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal. Cairo, the center of power in the region since the day of the Romans, was barely 200 miles away. The Suez Canal, the all-important jugular vein of the British Empire, was within striking distance. All that remained in the way was a little railroad station by the sea called El Alamein, and the battered British army defending it. The new field marshal saw no reason to let this impediment stand. Possibly riding the high of his incredible successes, Rommel either overestimated the resilience of his own forces or underestimated that of the defenders. His exhausted men were moving towards the end of their newly extended supply lines. Moreover, finally learning from the Germans' use of the 88mm anti-aircraft cannon to punch through tanks at long range, the British defenders mustered a massive artillery barrage from every gun available. Rommel's tanks were especially vulnerable to this bombardment because they had been channeled into a narrow corridor between the sea and the Katara Depression, an area of desert with especially difficult terrain that made it impassable for mechanized forces. Fighting was intense, but ultimately the Allied position held at the cost of more than 13,000 lives. The 9th Australian Division counterattacked following the artillery bombardment and pushed the Germans back, securing the AUK his last victory in the Desert Campaign. But the Prime Minister had become impatient with the AUK's suggested timetable for offensive operations, which were set to begin in early September. This was likely due in part to Churchill's knowledge that a new front was about to open up in West Africa. Without a swift victory in Egypt and Libya, the planned invasion might face disaster. During a handful of meetings in London that July, plans for Operation Torch, a massive Anglo-American landing in northwest Africa, had been finalized. Fearing that any hesitation might jeopardize the plan, the Prime Minister sacked the dawdling AUK as Commander-in-Chief for the Middle East and acting commander of the 8th Army. Taking his place as second-in-command in the Middle East was General Harold Alexander, who had commanded the 1st Corps at Dunkirk. For command of the 8th Army, Bernard L. Montgomery was chosen. There will be no more bellyaching and no more retreats. He intended to go on the attack, but ironically, the meticulous general spent even more time preparing than the AUK had requested. That left the ball in Rommel's court, but when he again tried to break through on the night of August 30th, this time at Alam el Halfa Ridge, the Afrika Corps was met with heavy minefields and air attacks. On September 2nd, with fuel yet again being the limited factor, Axis forces retreated once more. The Field Marshal's seemingly unstoppable advance had well and truly stumbled. For the next 7 weeks, Montgomery gathered strength and reinforcements. When he launched a massive attack on October 23rd, he had 1,230 medium tanks ready to be deployed. Rommel was down to just 210. Of the Allied tanks, 500 were new American Sherman and Grant tanks, as good or better than anything the Axis had except the Panzer IV, of which Rommel had only 23. The offensive was costly, and the artillery fire tore tanks apart on both sides, but Montgomery was able to slowly wedge the 8th Army into the German-Italian position. Landmines that Rommel had planted to his rear and the anti-tank guns that now surrounded the British on 3 sides meant that the Desert Fox was killing 4 tanks for every 1 that he lost. Nonetheless, his enemy's numerical and logistical advantage was overwhelming. By the evening of November 2nd, the Afrika Corps had just 30 tanks in operating condition. When the Field Marshal signaled a retreat, Adolf Hitler was furious. He told Rommel to hold his position at all costs. But the battle was lost, and the Führer's anger wouldn't change that. The hurried withdrawal left the Allies in a favorable position. The Italian divisions had no motorized support and were practically abandoned when the Germans started driving back to Cyrenaica. Still recovering from the grueling Second Battle of El Alamein, Montgomery did not move quickly enough to capture Rommel on his retreat, but it hardly mattered. American forces began landing from Casablanca to Algiers just 4 days later on November 8th as part of the long-awaited Operation Torch. They formed the second half of a massive pincer movement against the Axis remains on the continent, marking the beginning of the end of Rommel's campaigns in North Africa. When we last left off, the Desert Fox was on the run. In November 1942, Erwin Rommel and his forces escaped capture at the hands of Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army. He was outgunned and outmatched, but not out of the fight. The last 2 months of the year would prove to be dramatic, as would the next. On November 8, 1942, more than 100,000 Allied troops landed at 3 points in Morocco and Algeria, arriving to the rear of Rommel's embattled Afrika Corps. The landing sites, Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, were themselves a compromise between 2 very different visions on the part of American and British planners. Winston Churchill's government had favored a more spread-out, large-scale deployment all over the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. Americans, on the other hand, were still concerned about the loyalties of the Vichy French forces in the area. Perhaps more significantly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Joint Chiefs feared the possibility that such a large movement in the Western Mediterranean would provoke a response from nationalist Spain, which had been nominally neutral so far, but had a strong affinity for the Axis powers. Ultimately, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower decided on a happy medium. Operation Torch included 3 prongs, which would reach into the Mediterranean, but only as far as Algiers. The Western Task Force was entirely made up of 30,000 American men and was led by George S. Patton in their landing at Casablanca. The Center Task Force was made up of 39,000 American ground troops, but with a British naval escort who landed in Oran, Algeria. Lastly, the Eastern Task Force, made up of 10,000 Americans and 23,000 British troops, was also protected by the British Navy on its way to Algiers. Altogether, the force involved in Operation Torch, called the British First Army, despite its heterogeneous makeup, was more than 100,000 strong and led by British General Kenneth Anderson. When they arrived on November 8th, the disposition of Vichy forces in the area was largely still a mystery. As military historian Brian Lane Herder explains, French officers' loyalty to the Vichy regime varied. The Nazis were generally disliked to despised, but seemingly non-stop British and American military disasters hardly inspired confidence in defying the Wehrmacht. Though the Allies were uncertain of Vichy France's allegiance, U.S. General Mark Clark met with Charles Mast, Resident General of France in Tunisia, before the invasion as part of an extended campaign of subterfuge designed to garner French support in North Africa. However, the secret of Clark offered scant on details of Operation Torch. Many of the French troops stationed in the area had no idea what was coming. When American and British troops set foot in French North Africa, the garrison forces were so confused and hesitant that they did not resist the landings. They did, however, put up stiff resistance at the cities of Casablanca and Oran. This miscommunication was almost fatal to the operation. Since they had not expected meaningful resistance, there had been no naval or aerial bombing in advance of the attack, and it looked like the Center and Western Task Forces were in trouble. Eastern Task Force, on the other hand, had little difficulty seizing Algiers, which they did the same day they landed. Charles Mast commanded the French in this sector and ordered his men to stand down with the tentative approval of his superior, Admiral François D'Erlon. The admiral, a notorious Nazi collaborator and deputy leader of the country, was an opportunist above all, and had hinted he would be willing to defect to the Allies. Seeing which way the winds were blowing, he ordered a ceasefire, first in Algiers and then in North Africa generally. With basically no authority to do so, D'Erlon negotiated a nominal cooperation agreement with the Allies on November 13th, called the Darlan Agreement, allowing for the use of civilian infrastructure as well as actual military support. Up north, Hitler stopped pretending to respect French sovereignty and invaded the Free Zone that had remained unoccupied after the fall of France in 1940. On November 9th, German reinforcements began flying in from their newly captured airfields into Tunisia. By the end of the month, the German soldiers in the country numbered 15,000, bolstered by another 9,000 Italians who arrived by road from Tripoli. Both Allied and Axis armies wanted to reach Tunis and fortify it first. Making the situation even more urgent was the coming Tunisian wet season. Heavy rains would likely mean impassable roads, and perhaps more than a month of safety for whoever occupied the capital city when they began. The war in Northwest Africa was a race against time. Logistical delays meant that Kenneth Anderson could only begin the offensive on November 25th, 1942. They advanced quickly along the coastal road, but were checked around Bizerte 10 days later by the 5th Panzer Army. Among the reinforcements the 5th Army had received were a handful of the cutting-edge Panzer VI Tiger tanks for field testing. When General Jürgen von Arnim arrived on December 9th to take control of all Axis forces in Tunisia, he had some of Nazi Germany's newest toys with him. With these and his other assets, von Arnim was able to expand his defensive position in Bizerte and Tunis into one larger defensive line. From this strengthened position, he was able to fend off Anderson's Christmas Eve offensive just as the infamous Tunisian downpours began. Operation Torch had ground to a halt as 1942 came to an end. The Germans and Italians would be able to defend their new perimeter in the new year, but that tactical victory came at a strategic cost. Tanks and men sent to Tunisia were desperately needed elsewhere, especially against the Soviets in the east. In early January, Rommel's retreating Afrika Corps arrived in southeast Tunisia, still on the run from Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army. Knowing that he was seriously outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the two-pronged Allied advance, he would take advantage of his ability to move more quickly within a constrained space to attack multiple points in quick succession. Leaving a partial force at the old French Meurthe line, he decided to attack the Western First Army, first, aiming to drive them back through the narrow passes between the Atlas Mountains near Gafsa. The assault saw reasonable success. After a few probing attacks, the true assault came on February 14th, when the 21st Panzer Division attacked the US 2nd Corps, destroying 100 American tanks near Sidi Bouzid. Rommel urged the division commander to continue the attack after his initial success, but he waited another day for authorization from von Arnim, who was technically in charge. They pushed the Americans back 50 miles to Kasserine Pass, where they put up a stubborn resistance that lasted for 5 days. Meanwhile, Rommel himself peeled off and captured an Allied airfield at Telepete on February 17th. Rommel hoped to then push north to Tebessa, an American logistical nexus, but Arnim was unwilling to commit to such an aggressive attack. Instead, on February 19th, he was ordered to attack northwest at Tala instead, just where Anderson was expecting. When the Axis finally punched through Kasserine on February 20th, Anderson was ready with reinforcements and ground attack aircraft that beat Rommel back 2 days later. Having lost the momentum of his final assault and facing renewed Allied strength, Rommel was on the verge of defeat in North Africa, and as it turned out, attacking the western prong first may have been a grave miscalculation. Montgomery's 8th Army had been strung out in its pursuit, and only one division faced the Meurthe line on February 26th. When Rommel attacked 10 days later, its strength had quadrupled. Having finally learned the utility of anti-tank guns in the field, the British chewed right through Rommel's forces and repelled his attack. It was around this time that the Desert Fox, allegedly dealing with serious illness, was recalled to Europe. It was an ignoble end to the famous general's campaign. Von Arnim was left in the unenviable position of picking up where Rommel had left off. On March 17th, George Patton's 2nd Corps tried to cut off the Afrika Corps retreating along the coast to Tunis, but their attack was ultimately parried in the mountain passes. Nonetheless, the danger of such a development was established. 3 days later, the bulk of the 8th Army began a more direct assault on the Meurthe line, while the New Zealand Corps made a wide flanking maneuver and assaulted from the rear near Al Hama. The frontal assault ultimately failed to completely punch through the line, so Montgomery began shifting attention to the flank on March 23rd. Facing the prospect of encirclement, the Germans and Italians began quickly retreating. Their defense at Al Hama lasted long enough for most of the Afrika Corps to escape before the Allies finally breached the line on March 28th. On April 11th, all Axis elements had joined together in the northeastern portion of Tunisia. You might think that the reasonable strategic decision at this point would be to pull your forces out of the theater to better defend Europe. You'd be right, but that's not what the Axis did. Instead, they demanded von Arnim defend a 100-mile perimeter around Bizerte and Tunis. By the end of April 1943, Axis defenses in the region were being strained to the limit. After steady Allied advances, a relative calm took hold for the next 2 weeks, except to the northwest, where Americans and a French North African Corps were able to reach within 20 miles of Bizerte. During this period, Anderson redeployed his forces in preparation for one final strike from the north, using dummy tanks and other decoys to trick von Arnim into assuming the attack would instead come from the south. Overnight on Wednesday, May 5th, the 4th Indian and 4th British Infantry Divisions broke through the German perimeter after an intensive aerial and artillery bombardment, clearing the way for the 6th and 7th Armored Divisions. Though the British forces had only advanced about 5 miles closer to the city, Axis defenders could no longer effectively maneuver in their defense. During the evening on Saturday, the British entered Tunis, while almost simultaneously, the Americans and French broke into Bizerte. The formal surrender of Axis forces in the area, resulting in as many as 250,000 prisoners, wouldn't come until the next week, finally bringing the war in that theater to an end. When all was said and done, the worst fears of the German High Command had been realized. In pursuit of Mussolini's new Roman Empire, they had overextended themselves while forces were desperately needed elsewhere. The North African campaign was a war of attrition, and after 3.5 years, it was clear that the logistical apparatus of the Allies had decisively outmatched its Axis counterpart. Rommel's strategic mind was undoubtedly gifted, but so were those of his adversaries. Many of the Allied leaders that had cornered the Desert Fox would serve in the Allied invasion of Sicily and the Normandy landings within the next 2 years. Stephen W. Sears writes this: "For some, North Africa was the first step on the road to military fame. Eisenhower became Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, with Montgomery the head of ground forces. But for others, the Desert War was the climax of their military careers. Wavell and Auchinleck later served in relative obscurity in the Far East. General Ritchie ended up as a corps commander in Europe under Montgomery. For Erwin Rommel, the future brought only disillusionment and doom. In July 1944, a group of generals tried to kill the Führer by planting a bomb in his headquarters. Rommel took no part in it. However, he did not know that the conspirators planned to name him head of state if they succeeded. But Hitler survived, and in the purge that followed, Rommel was implicated. They gave him the choice of suicide by poison or a public execution with its disgrace to his family and memory. Help fight demonetization by visiting thearmchairhistorian.com.